This podcast is for educational purposes only and does not provide medical advice or create a doctor-patient relationship. Please do not rely solely on this discussion. Always consult your own healthcare provider and verify information independently. If you're in crisis or experiencing a mental health emergency, call 911 or go to your nearest emergency department.
Joshua Laycock is a registered psychotherapist and men's mental health coach. He helps men reconnect with masculinity, strengthen relationships, and build confidence. He brings over 20 years of experience from the financial and insurance world, with over a decade working closely with men as a coach and now therapist. He blends psychotherapy with practical, real-world tools tailored to men and guides men to explore their past, hard-faced truths, and break old patterns. Outside of therapy, he trains in jiu-jitsu, works out, and shows up for his family. A very warm welcome to today's episode, Joshua, and discussing a really untapped topic in relation to men's mental health. So, what inspired you to specialize in men's mental health, and what was there a defining moment for you or an experience that led you into this field?
Yeah, no, thanks for having me. And I always welcome the opportunity to talk about this stuff. Yeah, I mean, I think like a lot of people, I came to it from my own needs. I've told this story before, but I think I know, I remember I was living out west in North Vancouver, one of the most beautiful places on the planet, and I had the job that I want. I had hit all my financial goals. I had a young son. I had a dog. Heck, I even found my dream truck on an old parking lot for sale. I was married and life was good, and I was miserable. And I had done everything that I was quote unquote supposed to do. I'd gone to school. I have a top tier finance degree. Like everything should be clicking. And on paper, I was amazing. But I was struggling, and I don't know if it was being a new father or if it was the pressure of the new job or trying to navigate at the time a relatively young marriage and trying to figure these things out. But I just remember being miserable, and I would go for these long walks in the forest with my dog, and my mind would be racing. I was anticipating conflicts in my mind, particularly at work. And I was just miserable. And I thought, this is ridiculous. Like, I've done everything that I'm supposed to do. What's going on? I was also quite lonely. I didn't have a lot of friends out there. I'm not the most social person. And, really long story kind of medium is I ended up finding a podcast that talked about, I remember what it was. In the middle of the night, I Googled, because it was the middle of the night and I couldn't sleep, like, how do you shut your brain off? Mm. And I found a book, and this book changed my life. And the book led me to, let's listen to this author on some podcasts. The podcast was hosted by a guy who ran a men's group. Took me a long time to build up the courage to eventually join the men's group. And then I ended up leading or was a leader within that men's group. And that is how everything sort of catapulted. And I was purely digesting and using it for very selfish means, right? I was trying to better myself. And then it came into a time where people were asking for my time. Hey, can I bounce ideas off of you? I'd mentioned that, I'm a little busy right now. I said, well, obviously you're a coach. Why don't I pay you? And I was like, yes, I'm a coach. How about this much money? He was like, sure, done, let's go. And that was the very, unglamorous beginning of my coaching career, was people who just kind of wanted my time to work with me. And I had never really thought about being a coach. Both my mom, my biological father, I was raised by my mom and my stepfather, but I'm very close with my biological father, my dad. And my dad and my mom were both child social workers. I grew up in and around it. All her friends were social workers. So I never thought of it. I was going to be a finance guy.
Right.
But yeah, that was kind of how I landed in that space. But it really came from a very humble beginning of, I had this kind of inflection point in my life where I thought, if I don't figure this out, like, I'm not going to be a good father. I'm not going to be a great husband, or worse, I won't stay a husband for very long. What's going on here? Mm-hmm. And that book, called Unbeatable Mind by a Navy SEAL named Mark Devine, was the first book that I had ever read about how to train your mind similar to how you train the body. And it was the first time that I ever had this moment that this stuff between my ears could be an asset rather than just a pure liability. So yeah, that was it.
Wow.
It was just looking around going, like, I think a lot of guys, like, I should be happy, but I'm not. And thankfully, for whatever reason, I was not content with that. I was not going to be like, all right, I guess this is it. I guess life's a scam.
It seems the role chose you.
It seems to, right? I really do, at the risk of making it sound bigger, I do feel like this eventual migration into being a full-time therapist was a calling.
Right.
I've always been fascinated with callings and this sort of thing. And like, I'll be honest, it was deeply inconvenient. I resisted it. It was a whole lot of work. And it was a whole lot of things.
But it's all of those same character traits, perhaps to an extent within men as well, that obviously led you first to resist, but then to ultimately embrace this new beginning.
It's the hero's journey, right? Obviously, I'm not calling myself a hero, but it's the hero's journey. It's this calling, it's the resistance, it's the kind of coming home, leaving home, coming home, this whole journey, right? Which I think is huge. And there's a reason why these movies that are built on the hero's journey resonate, especially with men. I think with a lot of women as well, but especially with men. And yeah, it was something that I was compelled to do. And I left I ended up working in insurance for a very long period of time. And I left my insurance job only 3 months ago, I think it was now. And it's funny because everyone's like, oh my God, you just like up and quit one day. Because I didn't broadcast what I was doing. I didn't know what I was going to be doing. I didn't have any plans to necessarily leave. I always thought maybe I'll just do this part-time or whatever. But I've had people say like, you just one day up and quit. I was like, yeah, one day, 10 years of work
in the making,
10 years in the making. It's
Absolutely.
Like that. People that say like, I'm a 10-year overnight success. It's like, this was a 10-year all of a sudden decision.
So over the time, now that you've been working with men, how has your view of men's emotional needs evolved over the time? And what gaps potentially do you see in mental health services that may have motivated your work?
Sitting with as many men as I have over the course of the decade, but it's been really condensed in the last 2 years as a therapist, it's suggested to me that it's worse than I think people think it is. There's a real quiet desperation. But it's also given me hope that with the right inputs, beyond just therapy, these men can really change their lives around and become very powerful, potent kind of beings in the world. And I want to caveat, I'll reference a guy named Dewey Freeman, who is this phenomenal therapist out of Colorado that I've had the pleasure of working with as I've attended some of his events and stuff. I always say he's my mentor. He just doesn't know it. But when I say powerful, that can be really off-putting for some people, especially around the conversations of men. And when I say powerful, what I mean, which is a Dewey kind of statement, is a powerful relationship is one in which someone influences and can be influenced. And our ability to be open to being influenced by our environment as much as we want to kind of influence it and or control it. So when I say powerful, a lot of times what we're really talking with these men is a softening of the soul, and really striving for what a lot of men I think they want, which is control. Which,
right.
I mean, that's probably the biggest variable that we have to work through in session is as men, our relationship with control. And what does that really mean?
Right. So in that journey, what are the most common issues have you found that men struggle with? And, ideas about masculinity shape the way they express or hide their struggles.
So there are a lot of things that show up fairly routinely. I almost want to say brainwashing or indoctrination into their reality, and I say that in air quotes, that their worth is defined by their output. In other words, how many widgets they create, how much money they bring, and then by extension, how big of the house they have, what kind of car, what kind of clothes. I mean, even some of the most enlightened men that I know on the planet really struggle with this idea of, but still my worth is tied to my outcome, my output, right?
The external locus of control.
How much I make. It's let's be real honest, right?
Right.
And I don't know if it's tied, I think maybe sort of anthropologically it's tied to like, the more wealth I can accumulate, then in theory I can attract the highest quality mate and da-da-da-da-da. But I think quite frankly, and I'm sort of playing with these ideas, is that since the Industrial Revolution and particularly the two world wars, especially here in the West where men were called to fight, we really adopted this shut up and work mindset. And, I think it's an important part of, I think, being a man, this kind of just shut up, get the job done. It's not that it's wrong, it's that it's woefully incomplete. So I think a lot of men think their sole value is in production. It is in earning as much money as I can. And that's why, most men who really, really struggle, and a significant number of male suicides follows a job loss.
Right.
It's job loss and relationship struggles. But that is such a huge, like we ask, hey, how are you? What do you, nice to meet you. Who are you? We often define that by our vocation, right? Our profession. And we eyeball each other and, we have a pretty quick sense of like, how are you doing in the world financially? So that's a big one, is this kind of tying to financial worth. Another big one, I think, is, look, as men, we all make mistakes. As humans, we all make mistakes. I'm seeing men really conflating this notion of consequences and punishment. In other words, yes, I have to face the consequences of my actions, but we default that to being punishment. And I think for a lot of men, we think, if I can punish myself sufficiently for this mistake that I've made, whatever that is, then the world will see that I'm taking it seriously. And if I could just beat myself up, then maybe I can kind of almost convince myself that I'm not that guy. Not realizing that in that self-loathing and in that punishment, we're creating this repellent energy that pushes everyone else away. I see a lot of this in like relationship rupture repair cycles.
Right.
Let's say that in particular case, the man was the one who made the mistake in the relationship, whatever that is. This constant self-loathing, right? This deep indoctrination of shame. I often say to guys, maybe we could just get back to some good old-fashioned.
And sometimes, I'm sorry to interrupt you, but I hear that theme a lot in the fathers of my patients, who, whether it be potential alcoholism, rupturing the family, and then that perhaps, ongoing just detachment from the rest of the family, and that, as you described, that self-loathing, self-punishment, perhaps difficulty to acknowledge, difficulty to forgive oneself as well. Absolutely, and it drives people away, not consciously, but I think first of all, energetically, it creates this really unsafe energy. It creates a volatility, it creates a hostility, and we are energetic beings, whether we know it or not. And I think we get that vibe, right? So if we're trying to repair with a partner, and you walk through the world with this self-loathing, that puts out a very unsafe energy. And so I think a lot of our partners and the people in our world sense that. I think if we can't accept the mistakes that we've made, what that might mean about us, and where does that come from, and do I think that I still have the potential to be a good human being? When you can sort of walk that path and accept that, which is a lot harder than just sitting there and beating yourself up. Right. Let's be real honest about that. That's the path to growth and healing and understanding, why did I do the thing? Right? Why did I do that thing? And then in other words, if I can accept that I did it, and I can start to understand why I did it, then I actually can start to create a defense against, so I don't do it again. Correct. Underpinning everything that I do, and this is true for women as well, but I say a lot of things when I say men, it's because I take a men's perspective from it. It doesn't mean that it's unique to men. But I think everyone is exactly where they are, based on their experiences, their relationships, the relationships that they've been a part of in the world. Everything makes sense. The therapeutic process really, for me, is just understanding why it makes sense and what do we want to do about it, right? So when I walk in with these men and say, look, everything that you've done makes sense. What does that mean? It means you're not a bad person. It means you don't have a character defect. It means you've made a mistake. Now, yes, those circumstances may have brought you to the point where you had a decision to make. And for whatever reason in that moment, this decision that you took felt like the right one. And in hindsight, you realized it wasn't. But oftentimes when people cross that line, whether it's infidelity or something financial or whatever, criminal, they usually look back and go like, I never could have thought I would do that. I never would have thought that I was the kind of guy who could have done that. I was like, well, yeah, that's part of the problem, is our failure to acknowledge what we're capable of means we're kind of blind to it, which means that when we're confronted with these things, we're not adequately prepared
to know how to deal with it, right? It's like learning CPR before you choke.
Right.
You need to know it's there to kind of defend against it. So for a lot of these guys, I think it's getting rid of this shame. When I say like the hard path is always the right path, and that's not like bro stuff, right? Like that's not punishment, but wherever you don't want to go, that's where you're supposed to go.
But with following from that, what are those kind of misconceptions about men's emotional expression do you encounter? I mean, how do these misunderstandings impact, for example, their willingness to accept help?
Yeah, so let me go back to this. I think a lot of this stems from, although I'm sure it's always existed, but I think it's really been pervasive since kind of the Industrial Revolution and these two world wars, where we have multiple generations of men, not in the homes, but now teaching their boys by coming home at the end of the day, stressed out, I'm frustrated, I'm doing exactly what I need to do to survive, and I'm going to teach my sons how to survive. And that shut up and work kind of mindset. And so we have now multiple generations of men who were told that to be a good man, you shut up and work, you shut up and work, you shut up and work. There was a time, and there are times where, it's like, yeah, I'm feeling something. I may have to subordinate my feelings in the moment in order to get something done, right? I always picture if my child injures themselves, I'm going to be scared and I'm going to be fearful, but that's not the time to feel that. I have to subordinate those feelings in the moment and deal with what has to happen. The challenge is we have multiple generations of men who are told to subordinate what you feel in order to get stuff done.
Right.
We are in this war zone. We think we're in war. It's why so many men are so easily moved into fight, flight kind of mindsets. So to answer your question, I think, why are we doing it? I think because, quite frankly, for multiple generations, we were told that's not what men do, right? We were not told that you need to take time for yourself. We were not told that you need to recover, that you need to ask for help. A lot of times it's just, however well intended, multiple generations of, no, we don't have time for that.
But that expression also differs intergenerationally as well, in terms of, say, for example, a 40-year-old 20 years ago compared to a 40-year-old now. I mean, sometimes, the degree of resilience can also change over time, and also culturally as well, in terms of men, whether abroad or here. Have you seen any changes that way? Or has it still fairly uniform based on whether it was 30-year-old 30 years ago, 30-year-old 20 years ago, 30-year-old present day?
I think what we're seeing, although, you hear on one hand, you hear like, oh, younger people nowadays aren't nearly as tough, as resilient as they used to be. But then you pull up an article from 40 years ago and they said the same thing. And they pull up an article 100 years ago and they say the same thing. So I think it's probably more of an aged, maybe slightly more wisdom-based view looking backwards and going, you're not where I am now, right? Like, it's like when I raise my young son, sometimes I forget he's 11. And I see him making all the same mistakes that I've made, and I don't want him to make them.
And then you have some people saying, search and interrupt, but some people saying, but we were able to do this, but we were able to get through this. But I think it's a totally different set of variables the current generation are facing compared to what we would face 20, 30 years ago.
Yeah, I mean, I think
it's a different form of stress, a different form of burden.
Absolutely. So part of what I look at when I talk about masculinity, and I think a man, and I don't mean this as like a challenge, right? Or like, you're not a man. I never use it as a weapon.
Right.
But when I say a man, I mean someone who is mature, who is settled into his masculinity and is able to walk through the world with presence, grounded, making the people around him safer, and having this kind of ability to scan and go, what does the world need of me right now? It's a very Frankel kind of approach, right? Like, what is the world asking of me, rather than what do I ask of the world? I think the confident, grounded, masculine man has always been fine. His role is to look at what the world needs of him right now and to provide it, while also making sure that the things that are important to him have been taken care of. Like, if you look at like ancient Greeks, their young boys weren't allowed to touch a sword until they were taught music and poetry. There was an expectation of a roundedness, but when the time came, you went to war, you did what you needed to do. As we move through, like I said, you have this kind of period of time where there wasn't really much time for leisure. There wasn't much time for embracing poetry and all this kind of beautiful things in life. It was warring and soldiering and surviving. the men who were able to maintain that well-rounded form of masculinity, I think, were able to navigate that era with more grace. Men who, out of necessity, were sucked into this one-dimensional view of masculinity really started to struggle, and because what was expected of them was changing. And I think what's happening now is I think masculinity hasn't changed. I think the masculine, confident men walking through this world, that hasn't changed. I think there are fewer of those men because we don't have those kind of masculine, mature, wisdom-bearing men initiating these men. So now we're kind of multi-generational, where we have boys initiating boys. And you look around the world, what do we have? We have gang culture, and that's essentially what happens when boys initiate boys. But what I think is happening is the world has always changed, and men have always had to adapt with what the world requires of them. I think right now what we're dealing with is change on a speed. Sort of the delta of what's changing has been faster and faster than ever.
And is that why men are probably more resistant to seeking help, because they have to show that they are strong, being strong, for example?
I actually think that men in the history of forever are more willing to ask for help now than they ever have.
Okay.
I think what's happening is the world is shining a light on the problems that men are facing and how much we're struggling. So I think it's more prevalent. But I think, or it's more in our faces. I think we're more aware of it. But I actually think if we were to really step back, and this is one of those, like, does the media make it sound like it's a lot worse than it is? I think we now have a better understanding of how much men are struggling. And I think maybe men are probably struggling even more because the world is moving so fast that we're not adapting. But are fewer or more men seeking help? I think more men are seeking help. Like the idea of a therapist like me being able to have enough clientele to have a full roster in 2025 probably wouldn't have existed 10 or 15 years ago. Right. To be able to show up in a relatively small town. I grew up in the GTA, but being out here in Kingston, being able to hang my shingle and say, I only work with men. I only work with a certain type of men, the kind who generally don't want to talk to therapists or never thought they would. The fact that that's a viable business model now speaks to the fact that there's more and more people asking. So I think we should be really clear. I think more and more people are asking. I think it's more challenging, or I think it remains to be challenging for a lot of men because, quite frankly, they thought that, quote unquote, they'll lose their man card if they ask for help. I also think that we have to own, as men, the truth that a lot of the really bad things in the world have been caused by men. And that's a difficult cross to bear for a lot of men. And I think for a lot of women, or a lot of that male population who have been victimized by these type of very broken, sad, scared men who are causing all this pain, there's a real reluctance to want to engage with these kind of men. Right? So we have to own the fact that we're out there. Men are causing a lot of trouble. It's harder to be empathetic. So when a man does kind of share something or express what they're feeling, it's not always as well received because it's really hard to differentiate a well-meaning spouse who maybe raised his voice from a guy who has been convicted of rape or of assault or violence, right? Oftentimes men are painted with the same brush, and sometimes these conversations can contribute to that, right? When we say men, we have to recognize there's variabilities and all these sorts of things. But I think that it's not always safe for men to talk about these things. I was on, I want to say, LinkedIn, and someone was trying to have a conversation about men's mental health and seeking resources for men, and was comparing how many resources were available for men versus women. And the comments, which are inevitable, was like, great, now I have to deal with the fragile ego of men too. And as much as that puts a really kind of visceral, knee-jerk reaction to me, I'm like, yeah, maybe we do. Maybe we do. I think we're not listening to what men need. I think we're not showing up for men the way that a lot of men need. And as a result, they do get defensive.
We could go on for quite a while. And but lastly, what message would you share with people who are listening right now who feel stuck, overwhelmed, unsure, to ask for help?
First of all, know that it's okay to feel that way. I think when you listen to how my story started, right? It's really scary to confront the fact that this thing that is laid out in front of me, this world, this life, is not making me feel the way I want it to make me feel. And also recognize that whatever you're feeling, however you're walking through the world, it isn't your fault. And what I want to be clear with that. What do I mean by that? It means that the variables that are influencing how you're showing up, the pain you're feeling, the way you feel disconnected in your marriage, the way you feel like you're too angry as a father, the way you're having a hard time talking to women if you're trying to meet someone, the way that you're showing up at work. Maybe you've got into some people-pleasing mentality where you're really hyper vigilant to avoid conflict, and now you've realized I've just become a doormat. None of the variables that have brought you there are your fault, but it is 100% your responsibility.
Right.
And what are you going to do with this? So when I say men are going to have to take the hard path, it's actually a lot easier to just sit back and soak in this feeling of self-loathing. It's not fun, right? I'm not calling men out, but the work that needs to be done is the courage to start to have a phone call, to start to put it out there. I don't like the word vulnerability. I was working with a guy who was a Marine down in the States, and I'll cleanse it to keep this G-rated conversation, but he was like, don't ever freaking tell me to be vulnerable. I've spent my whole world fortifying myself against being vulnerable, right? For men who are very literal in these things, we think of vulnerable as being open to attack. And what I often say to guys is find a space where you can feel comfortable taking off your armor, even if only for a few minutes, right? Now, if you're not 100% sure how your partner is going to react to you sharing that you're struggling, maybe find a buddy. If you're not sure how your buddy's going to react, that's a really great place to come and have an initial conversation with a therapist. Ideally, someone who understands sort of men and how men walk this earth. But, that's what I try to offer these guys, is simply a space where for a few minutes you can take off your armor. You can be real with me with knowing there's no risk of judgment here. And then we go from there.
Right.
And as you learn these skills, because really what we're talking about is emotional mastery. And I think a lot of men sit feeling really ashamed or embarrassed at not knowing how to speak the language of emotion. And, if I were all of a sudden, I don't know, start finishing this conversation in Japanese, I don't know that you would feel ashamed at not understanding what I was saying or not being able to respond to me in Japanese on the presumption you don't speak Japanese. It's the same as this language of emotion.
Right?
So recognize that it's a very disorienting process.
Mm-hmm.
But in fact, calling these men out or up is because of how hard it is, because of how scary it is, and because of how uncomfortable it is. It necessarily means it's the right path.
Correct.
So if we're going to tap into that sort of masculine ego of I can figure stuff out, I'm a fixer, I just like to get things done, I'm a man of action, it's like, okay, I hear you. Put your money where your mouth is. Put your time where your mouth is.
Mm-hmm.
And go out and seek solutions. But we have to move through this extended period of self-loathing and shame and beating myself up because I feel like that's the only way forward. It's not. It holds us back big time. So just surrender to that a little bit, which is a scary word for guys.
Fantastic. Joshua, it's an absolute pleasure. Thank you so much for your time. Really appreciate it.
Thanks. Hope we can do it again sometime.
Fantastic. Thank you.